Morning, everybody. Got some kind of puffy eyes today. My allergies are bothering me. It's that time of year, though. I tell you what, in 2020, we don't complain as much about allergies, do we? We kind of just live with it and roll with it. Today, I'm going to talk about two of my favorite Avant Garde records. I'm often on the record for saying Avant Garde isn't essential, it's not necessary jazz. And on some levels, that's very true. On some levels, I still love a lot of it. The stigma I'm trying to get rid of is too many people portray this as this is the only jazz that's relevant today. And that's not the case. The setting my mindset comes from, first and foremost, when I critique music, when I say this is good, this is accessible, it's coming from the sensibility of a DJ. I've played music in front of people for 20 years. I've tried and tested a lot of things. My history with music comes from heavy metal startings, in the classic rock, psych rock, prog, alternative, 90s industrial. I went through all those phases, noise, avant-garde, ambient, from Eno to Kraftwerk, modern electronic, house, dance, funk, soul, blues, reggae, hip-hop, gangster rap, trap music, and jazz has its roots in almost all of it. It really does. I've tried every format, every sound you can imagine. Old classic country, up to about 1980. We don't really wander past that with country, do we? Waylon and Willie's about the end of it. You go back to Hank and Johnny Cash and those early greats, Patsy Cline, Skeeter Davis. I love that old stuff, but I can't really do no Garth Brooks and forward stuff. It's so campy. It's cheese metal with different hair, power ballads and the same power chords and just campy stuff. Integrity is always an important thing in music, and integrity is also an important thing with this channel. I posed some questions yesterday. I got some really thoughtful responses. Thank you to you guys. And in the end of the day, I have to be true to myself. I have to be true to what I believe in. And I don't think I can discuss jazz without discussing race, which ends up us discussing politics and economics. It's all an interwoven fabric. And for me, so much of the power of jazz music is interwoven into the struggle that exists being an oppressed minority. That's the magic in the music, is that all that ugly pain and suffering and torment comes this beautiful art form. That's the power. That's the magic. It's not just the musicianship. It's not just scales and chords and innovation. That's all a byproduct. And we'll delve into music, and I always have. But this channel from the very start has been about the black experience that fueled this great art form. And you can't discuss it without discussing economics and policy and race and history in this country and the current political climate today. It's not living in a vacuum disconnected from the past. The present and the past are extensions of the same fabric. And so it's impossible for me to be honest and integral and discuss what I feel. And ultimately, this is what this channel has always said. The music here isn't to talk about, let's say, how innovative such a player is or how much of a virtuoso somebody is. It's always been from the get-go, what does this music make you feel? And I find that so absent in so many jazz reviewers. And it's strange because I get it all the time from somebody listening to Nine Inch Nails or Kurt Cobain. They have no problem because of the lyrical context extrapolating what Marilyn Manson's trying to say. Who's the young goth chick right now? I got her album, I can't think of her name right now. Tip of my tongue. Billie Eilish. Kids can listen to her and come away telling me what they feel, how they can relate to it. The angst, the disconnection, the lack of hope. You shouldn't need lyrics to be able to express what music makes us feel. Films use music all the time to create emotional context, to create tension, to create fear, to create joy, to create romance, to create whatever you need. Music applies that in film to give us texture, context, emotional experience. So how can we listen to jazz in a vacuum and not apply its absolute barometers? The emotional context of the men who played or wrote it and invented it. And I don't think on any level I can do this and not end up coming back to this stuff at times. And music's always going to be the primary, but if my mind wanders into the economic ramifications of some of this art form, I don't think I could constrict that. We are in an election cycle, which has added some political context to some of it. Some of it's just the insanity of this election cycle. The current administration, the Black Lives Matter, the police it's all kind of a revealing structure that's linked back to the buildings of the past. We're just adding additions on. It's all part of the same story and narrative. And sometimes we have to look at the present just so people can understand what the past must have looked like and felt like. And if you think being on the street protesting during a pandemic is of consequence, the struggle that these guys went through in the 30s, 40s, and 50s was 10 times more real. Avant Garde, as a DJ, it's not something you can play for people. And so a lot of times when I'm saying this music isn't necessary for everyone to love, I'm not saying it's not good and I don't like it. And that gets misconstrued a lot. I've never said I don't love Miles Davis. I love Miles Davis. Is his place in the jazz kingdom elevated today by economics and the labels that are promoting? Yeah. He's not, in 55, seen as the savior, the messiah that jazz fans today think he is. Parker was that. Clifford Brown was that. There's a lot of guys who received all kinds of recognition at the time for being innovative and brilliant and geniuses. Miles Davis wasn't at the head of that list ever. And most often when he did get discussed, it was oftentimes because of the guys in his group. That Miles Davis group with that John Coltrane guy. That was what was shaking foundations. Not Miles and his mute. But it doesn't mean I don't love Miles and listen to Miles all the time. I do. And Miles is some of the most accessible jazz in the canon. I play Miles all the time at my gigs because people can dig Freddie Freeloader. People can dig some Sketches of Spain, some Quiet Nights, which I just reviewed yesterday. Which, again, a lot of people slag that. But in a bossa nova context, it's a beautiful record. It's a very melancholy, soothing, calm wash that cleanses the senses. And so a lot of times the barometer of what I'm saying is good or bad, it's not saying if you like it, you're an idiot at all. And a lot of times there's records I say I like or even love, but I'm not going to say this is great and everybody must have it. Because that would be disingenuous and it would turn more people away from the music than it would bring in. So I just want to clarify that me saying Avant Garde isn't the pinnacle of jazz and it's the only part of jazz that matters today, which I feel so many people seem to have that thought process. And that's what I'm trying to fight against. Saying, no, there's so much history in this music that, and most of it's very accessible. Most of it's very listenable. Most of it you can dance to, relax to, drink to, sleep with, fuck to. Have breakfast in the club to. So much jazz is extremely enjoyable for everybody. If you play Avant Garde when you're having some guests over, you're kind of being self-indulgent. That's the message I've been trying to say. Not that I don't like Avant Garde, I like a lot of it. Some of it's awful. Some of it's excessively noisy and lacks direction and melody and groove. And I'm going to say that stuff. Because that's part of what music is about. And oftentimes those records are meant to make us uncomfortable, meant to make us feel edged out. And they're not really meant to be easy, digestible listening on a daily basis. That's not what their art form was intended to do. That being said, I'm going to move on. Two of my favorite Avant Garde records. Number one is Grachan Moncur, Evolution. We're actually listening to the title track right now, Evolution. And It's just an interesting piece. It's moody. It's melancholy. Ellington, Mingus would both be like, "Yep, I get this." The band on this is very important. Grachan Moncur III, a great trombone player that was primarily in the Avant Garde. I believe this is his first recording, as far as I recall. He's got a second Blue Note, and then he makes more stuff on more avant garde labels into the late 60s and early 70s. But this is kind of my first knowledge of him anyway. We might have something on a small label before this, but Lee Morgan is on this, and then Morgan's one of those guys that can really adapt to any setting. Jackie McLean himself is going further out at this point, so he's a great piece to add to this mix. Bobby Hutcherson, I find him one of the most colorful vibraphone players in music history. The way he can use that vibraphone to color with pastels. Just soft tones that wash over your palette. He's a very interesting player, Hutcherson. And he can play in a blues context. He can play in a hard bop context. He can play at tempos. But he's also incredibly interesting with slow melancholia, with the avant-garde. He's able to really give dissonant chordings. And that's one of the things about pianos, guitars, vibraphones, is that a guy on a trumpet has to either bend a note to make it dissonant, almost missing it, or kind of slur a few notes together, but he's only really capable of one tone at a time. And a lot of the best structure for dissonance and edge is building chords. And you take a 1-3-5 and you make it a 1-3-6 or a 1-2-7. Like you mix a couple of the intervals up, and they go from the sweet, sugary, syrupy center. Suddenly you're adding that dissonant edge to something. That seventh instead of that fifth, or that sixth instead of that fifth, and it gives it that's where Monk and Ellington too, because the piano has that ability to always be able to adapt chords and to take them from their majors or even their minors and to make them these new innovative constructs. Monk did it all the time, blocking and chunking and giving you these dissonant sounds that you wouldn't really expect the ear to be ready for, but he always has this way of kind of dropping it in a way you're like, oh, yeah, I gotta wiggle through that, but I see the shape that he's kind of, oh, I like that. You know, a lot of instruments aren't capable of that. And so a guy like Bobby Hutcherson can play those mallets and drop some interesting blocks on those chords that will give you texture, background information. And once you have a guy playing on the piano or on the vibraphone an interesting dissonant chord, suddenly what that trumpet player or that saxophone player is telling us, he can rely on some of those abstract intervals to also sound very abstract and dissonant. Outside of that, a horn player has to start screeching and honking to create some dissonance on his own, which is what Coltrane does a lot of times. And a lot of his disciples just kind of latch onto that, and I'm not a fan of most of it. I feel like Coltrane's mission, that death statement, his mortality, it all kind of pushed him into some dark places. And there's an integrity and an honesty and a seeking, searching quality to what Coltrane's doing that I always find some complex, interesting points to what he's saying and doing. I can't say that for all what his disciples are doing. But Hutcherson's a very interesting point here. He gives a lot of interesting shade to the horn players to now color in. And if you're a horn player, you might say, well, I like what Hutcherson's doing right there. I'm going to shade between that 6 and that 7. Yeah, I'm going to bend in that little color zone, and I'm going to use that little dissonant chunk, and I'm going to play in that interval right there. And so it's very important, I think, for the avant-garde to have guitar or piano or vibraphone to give those contextual chords to really space out and fill in the colors. I think sometimes when it's just a sax player with a piano player you can't really hear, and then a drummer and a bass player, a lot of that fill is absent. And even with Coltrane, you don't hear McCoy Tyner often. And it can be exhausting for the listener, especially when you don't have the full chord blocking underneath it to give you the root, to give you the sweeter parts of the sound. And so that one dissonant interval goes from being an interesting accompaniment to becoming the main course. So I think Hutcherson's very important on a lot of the best Blue Note avant-garde records. And for a lot of people, Blue Note isn't avant-garde enough. But for my taste, for my listening needs, I don't think avant-garde's done better than what Blue Note does. The melancholy, the tension of this. The first track on this record has got a nice up-tempo, but it drops into different pockets. Air Raid. It starts off really slow, if I recall. Again, there's that melancholy, moody, swampy, atmospheric ooze. See what I'm saying? And there's Hutcherson giving you that chord. And so it starts off real atmospheric and really in this kind of deep, dark place. And then when the tempo drops in, it does become kind of more bright. And the air raid siren goes off. There's Grachan Moncur. He's got a great tone, which I think is also an important part about the avant-garde. If you have great tone, it allows you to reshape sound and still have some sweetness, some juice in the berry. If I start off with a sour piece of fruit, no matter how I twist it, it's still going to be kind of bitter. But if it's a nice, sweet pear, and I twist it a little bit, it's going to still have some sweet in there. There's that air raid going on, there's that siren, that war cry. And again, you cannot hear avant-garde and not contextualize, once again, the times that this music was made in. And on some level, jazz losing its audience to rock and roll, to R&B, to all the new sounds happening in the 60s. It's suddenly, if you're a chef and your restaurant has lost most of its occupants, and there's a bunch of new restaurants on the block and everyone's over there, I can't just keep making the same meal that no one likes or no one's interested in anymore. That's old hat now. We don't want old American dining food. We want new, interesting food. So on some level, everyone's gone on to these other meals. I, as a chef, as a musician, I have choices to make. I can keep beating the dead horse that's not going anywhere, or I can reinvent myself. And I think the avant-garde is a lot of these musicians saying to themselves, you know what? Our sales are greatly diminished. Jazz in itself has lost most of its audience. Let's take this as a chance to put our mark, our personal statements on top of this music and compose and arrange interesting, complex pieces that are deeply satisfying personally, and we know are going to appeal to a lot smaller of an audience, but our audience is very diminished now as it is. And we're kind of making an assumption as players that those who are left buying and consuming jazz are very willing to take some chances themselves. And that's very much what seems to be the case, is that the jazz consumers left by 65 are college beatnik kids, mostly white kids that are interested in the counterculture movement. And the avant-garde was this edgy expression of black musicians and white dabbling in the frayed ends of our society. And Coltrane, Ornette Coleman, Dolphy, Mingus, these guys are all screaming and stating a great dissatisfaction, a frustration, a need for change. The streets were full of climactic encounters with the police, demonstrations, protests, that turned into riots. It's what happens in the 60s is very explosive. It's a tinderbox. And then you add Vietnam on top of that, the conscripting of black musicians and into the army, being sent over to fight for a war that had very little relevance to anybody here, especially after you served in the Second World War and received none of that same freedom yourself as a people. And so the musicians recognized that we're dealing with a new beast. Jazz, as jazz was, is no more. Jazz was popular music for 4 decades. Now in 1965, it's a peripheral thing that will never really make the charts again. The bossa nova was the last real gasp of jazz crossing over and becoming mainstream. And there's times in the fusion movement where it gets some recognition, but even like Bitches Brew is an extension of the Avant Garde in a lot of ways. That's a very dissonant kettle. Again, listen to Hutcherson. Listen to Hutcherson shading pastel in the background. The softness. Avant Garde also uses dynamics really well. To me, great Avant Garde has extremes and dynamic shifts. It'll have very minute, minimal moments that will explode into these orgasmic, violent eruptions of sound. And my ears do not enjoy 40 minutes of cacophony. But when it's intervaled between melancholia and melody and mood and atmosphere, sometimes that tension, that explosion is almost a release, and you watch all the tendrils flare up, and then it kind of resettles down. Black Saint and the Sitter Lady is another great example of that. Mingus always brings it back to these kind of calmer pathways before he pushes it back out into the cosmos. This record is just a really solid foray into the avant-garde. Again, Blue Note never lets the whole thing dissolve. With Coltrane at Impulse, there was no fettering. And so he just went off, and Ohm and Ascension, and some of those records are such deep, dark, heavy listens, and it kind of tears a lot of the rules out of the book. And some of the other smaller labels, like, yeah, Coltrane's doing it, but those records weren't selling great for anybody. And they probably sold as many copies now in the last 20 years through reissue programs as they probably ever did in the day. I find a lot of it very hard to listen to, especially as I've gotten up in my years. Some of it's fun to revisit, but for me, that's perfect avant-garde. This isn't even that avant-garde right here. Mclean has that bright, tense sound all the time. That's called The Coaster. And then Monk in Wonderland's also fantastic. It just has this lilting, swinging, kind of sludgy groove to it. It's dark. You know, there's a dark depth to it that makes it a fantastic listen. And again, I wouldn't play this at a gig for people. You know, it would appeal to too few. The other record I want to showcase here is also one of Blue Note's great moments in the avant-garde. It's one step beyond Jackie McLean. And again, the band's important here. Grachan Moncur, once again. Jackie McLean, of course. Bobby Hutcherson, once again, is on the vibes. Tony Williams and Eddie Kahn is on the bass. So that's going to make these lineups very similar. We got no trumpet on this one. But we got McLean, Hutcherson, and Grachan Moncur. McLean, Hutcherson, and Anthony Williams. So the bass player changes and we drop a trumpet player here. But McLean always plays a bit sharp, a bit bright. And so he's always going to have a tension in what he's saying. And I don't think it was like an accidentally he's playing sharp. He has his mouthpiece set so that when he's playing the melody, it's always going to seem a little bright, a little brittle, a little on edge, which creates tension. It creates dissonance. That's one of the ways you can create dissonance as a horn player, is playing slightly sharp, slightly flat, bending and mutating notes. There's a difference between doing it intentionally and just searching, trying to find a note. They don't sound or feel the same. And there's some players you're like, oh, he's trying to find that center. And there's other guys who like that he found the center and now he's warping away from it. The blues, the guitar players, there's a lot of bending notes in the blues to create feeling, to create a little edge of the blue, the dissonant, the what is discordant. And it's part of the fascinating part of this music. Again, this is edgy stuff for Blue Note. They'll get a little further out than these records eventually with some of the Cecil Taylor stuff. Unit Structures, that's to me a record, I don't know if I've ever made it all the way through it. Even as a young guy, like it's just tumultuous. Too much so for me. There's a desperation in Mclean there. It's not comfortable. It's edgy. It's got some attitude. It's got some exhaustion to it, some frustration. And there's Grachan. The trombone's such an interesting instrument, and it's incredibly diverse. It can create blurts and rhythm and pulsing and sound. It's great at bending because of the way that valve slides. It's also great at being a colorful tone underneath. And one of the things it does least well is play individual notes with clarity. It's not its strong suit. And so when you hear guys like Curtis Fuller or J.J. Johnson or Jimmy Cleveland, those guys, how dexterous they are with that slide it's mind-boggling. And Grachan's not necessarily that type of player. He's more of a mood player. He's more of a guy that's going to give you texture. And again, the trombone back in the swing days was giving you blurts, and they were creating all kinds of sound textures with it. The trombone's a very interesting horn that really falls out of use by the 60s. So Grachan's kind of a weird revelation in the 60s on the trombone. You know, we had a few other guys come along. Roswell Rudd played some Avant Garde trombone, but it's not a big part of the Avant Garde, which is weird because it's actually an instrument that would probably lend itself to a lot of interesting colors and palettes. Another interesting common denominator between these two records is Anthony Williams. He's a young kid. He's full of ideation. He's bright. He's brilliant. He's well educated. He drives and pulses a lot of those great Miles Davis quintet records in the mid-60s, even before the quintet's official. Tony Williams is there as a young cat. He's a very interesting player who plays with a clarity and a driving pulse that oftentimes allows those horn players to have a very tight structure with which to dance over. I don't have to worry about dragging my drummer down or him losing his place and his time and his sync. He's going to stay locked in, which allows me to play with time and melody and groove and to shift and to waver and wander over top of it, knowing that his pulse will stay rigid. Williams is a pretty profound player with an incredible ability to drive and propulse the musicians. This is Frankenstein, another interesting track. It's, again, Mclean's just, it's a bit sour. His tone is a bit bitter. It leaves you thirsty almost, like a lemon squeezed onto your tongue. You're like, so much flavor, but it still leaves me kind of needing something. Like, it's a dry piece. Interesting stuff. And on side 2, some great stuff as well. Blue Rondo's fantastic and Ghost Town's wonderful. Nice up-tempo number there. This is Ghost Town, and Ghost Town's fantastic. It's probably my favorite track on the record. Again, who's creating melancholy? Hutcherson. Hutcherson's giving you those little chords. And again, chords have so much more ability to create dissonance, color, and atmosphere than a single noted horn can do. So it's a very important thing to have the construct of those chorded instruments in avant-garde, I feel like, because it gives a center to the edge. You know, it allows that root, that third, and that whatever the interval else you're adding, it gives you that same highway, but it gives you some of the billboards off to the side. If you're just off the road all the time, it's easy to lose your direction. But again, this is not something you would play for people at an event. It's something you would play as you neared a haunted house and you were looking to create attention in my audience, and those windows are broken, there's a bolt of lightning, and bats just flew out the chimney, and this don't look like the Addams Family. This could be a little bit uglier than that. Again, just kind of muddying its way through the marsh, the crackling of the branches, the unease. And so for the avant-garde, these two records by Blue Note, a label not really known to be proficient or deeply rooted in the avant-garde, these are two of my favorite avant-garde records. Both highly recommended if you like that. Again, that's the disclaimer there. I don't want to be one of those YouTubers out there saying, oh, everybody has to have these. That would be very misleading. Everybody should have Johnny Hartman and John Coltrane. There's a lot of great records that everybody should have. Kinda Blue. Everybody should have that. Dave Brubeck, Time Out. Talk about using some dissonance and edges of the avant-garde brilliantly to the point where you don't even recognize it as being that. Time Out is a brilliant record. So all these guys out there who think they're too cool for that, he's too cool for you. Because he took some stuff and reshaped it so creatively that you don't even recognize it as being as out as it is. He takes Turkish beats and makes them sound accessible. He takes weird time signatures and drops them into a comfortable place for us. That's brilliance. You know, brilliance is taking something that's so innovative and new that people shouldn't gravitate towards it. But if you do something so well, like Sgt. Pepper's, like A Day in the Life, the way that conducts crescendos, and it actually has some really dissonant moments as it's sliding its way up towards its pinnacle. There's some avant-garde in that. But when I woke up and got out of bed and drug a comb across my head, it re-livens and melody becomes the fore and the groove resets itself in. So there's a balance there. And I think that's a very key part to the avant-garde, is having balance, having chords to color out the full scale and the full sound of what we're playing on. That's an important factor. I don't want to hear 40 minutes of a guy honking a saxophone, ever. Ever. And any kid can pick up a saxophone and make it honk. It's not ability. It's just not. I had a few people get really mad at me when I talked about that Pharoah Saunders record, where on the end of side 1, on that Track of the Nile, I liked the first track and I said so. But numerous people, all they heard was me talking about the stuck pigs that it sounded like in part 2 when they had this awful screeching. And I could play that for 1,000 people, and I would bet you 900 of them, 950 of them would be like, please turn that off. Sounds like screeching pigs. And some people got so indignant about that. Again, honesty shouldn't get you upset. He was obviously going for the screeching pig sound in that part. He would probably be like, yeah, that's kind of what we were going for right there. I don't think he would have been offended by what I said. Somebody gets so indignant about criticism, about honest critique. And if you like that, that's great. That's not the issue. The issue is me being honest in what I review and what I share and what I say. That's what I can't get away from that. That's what it's got to be. I'm going to share honestly. And if I'm just going to praise every record I review, I have no baseline. I have no credibility. There needs to be an honest reference and points of basis so I can say, this is what you should like about this, and this is what I think people are going to shun away from. And to say that most people aren't going to like this doesn't mean you can't or shouldn't or that you're wrong. And if I come across that way, that's my mistake. That's not what I'm ever trying to say. If you love something, great. But don't just love it because you spent $60 on it, because some other guy on YouTube said you should have it. Be honest with yourself. If you like it, great. But if it's not really your cup of tea, don't be afraid to admit that either. And the most honest reference, honestly, is to say, once in a while, I really like this. I think that's the most honest way to see the really edgy, beyond out there avant garde stuff. Once in a while, I really like this. If that's all you listen to, you fit to masturbate a whole lot in your life, son. Because girls ain't going to stick around very long if you got that shit squawking all day long. That's just how that goes. So anyway, I appreciate you all for the feedback of the day. And for the most part, everyone said the same thing. Just be honest. Say what you feel. And again, the politics, I'm hoping once this election subsides, I can get away from it some myself. I am not a super engaged person in politics. I'm not an American citizen. I'm a Canadian. I don't vote. I mostly just observe once in a while. And most of my observations, I'm not even engaged watching the news. I don't look at my Facebook feed. Once in a while, something will slip through and hit me in the face and be like, damn, we still there? We still doing that shit? The politics, the media, it's all such a charade here. I don't believe hardly anything I see or hear. I don't trust what I see or hear on television, social media. It's all governed by a bottom line. Money's what I believe in. Any homicide detective can tell you that. Look for a motive. And motive pretty much comes down to sex or money in this world. Not much else drives the human male. Money and sex. And so most of what happens politically, economically, is driven by greed and money. And once you look for that motivation, you almost always have to come back to people with the deep enough pockets to be funding it so they can make more money. Only a really rich person will spend millions to make billions. And that's what history says happens throughout history. And so once in a while it slaps me across the face and I'm like, damn, we still doing this shit that we did hundreds of years ago? Shame on us. Shame on us. So I don't sit there glued to CNN and Fox News taking down notes going, no, I don't have time for that. My life doesn't have need for that. I don't care. But what I do care about is injustice. What I do care about is inequality. What I do care about is sensationalized bullshit that so many people fall into the trap of believing in. And you ask any group of fifth graders, how would you make the world a better place? And they're going to come up with some of the tenets of socialism and re-sharing economic distribution. That's it. It's a common sense thing. The wealth is in the hands of too few. And so that's where most of my political context comes from, is an overall general broad sense of, until we start really grasping that, things aren't going to get better. And here's the craziest thing about all of it, is the very people who tell us that socialism is bad, sharing is bad, is that same small percentage who owns all the wealth. Who stands to lose the most if we were to start doing those things? That should ring true to people. Of course the people in charge don't want us to go to a system that would take them out of their golden chairs. That's where people seem to be lost. Is the people who control the media, the people who control the politics, the people who control policy are the ones who are writing the textbooks and saying freedom is capitalism. And we're all staunchly marching going, yeah, freedom, freedom, freedom. Ooh, I love freedom. And it's only freedom for them. Because they've already got the wealth. They've already got the power. They've already got the militaries and the guns. And history will tell us very clearly that eventually people will take the power back. And so my context is never one where I'm trying to get people out to vote and say, do this, do that. Parties, both parties to me are a joke. It's a charade. The election to me means very little. And whether it's subverted and infiltrated, I don't care. The outcome's not going to change most things from a global American economic perspective. Multinational corporations are quaking in their boots going, I hope Biden don't win. And there's probably a number of corporations that hope the guy that's in power does lose because he's such a wild card. He's an anomaly. He's not part of the system. He's harder to control. He shoots from the hip. So there's probably interests out there that will be fine with him losing. Even people on the right conservative economic spectrum, to some of those people, he's got to be messing the waters up too much with his unilateral thinking. So again, my politics is only that in a broad, general sense. It's never me here politicking for one guy, candidate, or the other. It's just a broader understanding of how economics and policy and global community should function in order for us to change and make a lot of the injustice no more. That's where I'm coming from. And I just want to see mankind live in peace and harmony and be able to embrace their fellow humans from all corners of the world as my brother and sister. And to see our planet from the little space, photos of, Sagan taking our planet, the little pale blue dot picture from Neptune looking back at the Earth, that little pixel of light. We're a vulnerable marble of existence, and we need to be more in each other's corner. We need to see people outside of my race, my religion, my nationality as still my brother, my kin. But our lifetimes are so short and so preoccupied. That's fantastic. That most of us don't get the time to see through religion, see through nationality, see through race, and we allow ourselves to be divided. And what have the rich always done throughout history? They divide the lower classes against each other. And that's what I'm trying to speak about. Left, right, blue, red, urban, rural, it's all constructs that are artificial design so we don't have empathy for each other and actually affect change. So, 2 Avant Garde records I love. Both of them are fantastic if you like edge. They're both great records. And don't walk away from this thinking, oh, he doesn't like the Avant Garde. I do. I will listen to it when I'm in the mood for it. Do I think it needs to be in everyone's collection? No, it shouldn't be. If you don't like horror films, there's no point saying that's an essential film. You have to have it. No, if you like horror films, great. You should like that. And I feel like with food, with beer, with wine, with film, we're so much more willing to be honest and recognize that this is for that pocket. And the avant-garde people get so offended when you try to insinuate that this isn't for everyone. That to love jazz, you have to love Ornette. No, you don't have to love Ornette Coleman. Most of jazz at the time Ornette Coleman came around didn't love Ornette Coleman. Love what you love. Be honest. Be true to yourself. What you relate to is great. Don't say anybody else has to love it or shouldn't like it. And when I say this isn't for everyone, it's not saying it's not great. It's not good. A lot of it is fantastic. It's just meant for a smaller demographic. I'm the Jazz Shepherd. My name is Dan. Y'all be safe. Peace.